U.S. Birth Certificates. The History of Birth Certificates. Author, U.S. Birth Certificates Team. Last updated May 16, 2023. The history of the birth certificate might not seem like much, but it makes a vitally important milestone in the country's development and growth. Both birth certificates are with you from the first day of your life. However, despite this seemingly longevity, the life story of the birth certificate only began quite recently. To explore how this came and how this grew becomes an essential vital record in America, this article looks back over the history of birth certificates to explain why birth certificates are important today. How did birth certificates registration work before certificates? Birth records have been kept by governments around the world for thousands of years. This was primarily done to ensure authorities had a clear idea about their production, output, and taxable population. However, whilst birth records and other vital records like marriages and deaths have been collected by governments for a long time, birth certificates are still a relatively new phenomenon. Before birth certificates were made the norm, information on births was kept in church records. However, this was not a formalized process and there was no laws mandating when and how exactly a person should be legally recorded. Matters were also complicated by the nature of giving births in older times. Unlike today, most children weren't born in hospitals, and unfortunately, many didn't survive infancy. This means that some records for some people born at the time simply weren't kept at all. When were birth certificates first used? Considering how far back birth records go, it is a surprise that birth certificates only started appearing around middle of the 19th century. In 1835, the United Kingdom centralized a formalized birth record keeping. It was the first country to do so, and eventually other nations would start adopting similar methods. There were a few reasons having standardized birth certificate beneficial for some countries, including documenting large waves of European immigration across the Atlantic from the 19th century onwards, getting a better understanding of population demographics, monitoring national public health needs. The U.S., however, was a bit different. Instead of a central system collecting birth information, individual states collect their own records. There was no federal requirement for them to do so, however, and no standard way of recording births. It wasn't until 1902, however, that the United States introduced a nationally regulated process at a federal level. This was overseen at first by the Bureau of Census. At this point, a standard form was produced for registering births in each state, although state governments still had overall control over the issuance of birth certificates. This is still true today. Official recording of vital records by U.S. state. Each U.S. state started recording vital records individually at different times. The table below shows when each state began officially recording vital events in the form of birth, marriage, and death certificates. So you've got each state on the left and birth, marriage, and death records at the top. We're just going to scroll down for a few states on birth records. Alabama is 1908. Arkansas is 1914. D.C. is 1874. Hawaii is 1842. Ohio is 1908. Kentucky is not even on this list. Kentucky is not even on this list, ladies and gentlemen. Do you see that? We have GHI, Kansas, the only K in any of the records. 1902, 1946, increasing government oversight of birth data. During the first part of the 20th century, the federal government took on a much greater role in collecting birth records. However, the documents issued back then didn't quite look like birth certificates until you recognize today. A lot of data you normally find on a modern document, such as standardized birth certificate number, simply didn't appear. These older files were only used to collect rudimentary information about the child and their parents. Many families still had births at home instead of hospitals, too, and as a result, some children simply weren't correctly recorded. 1946, birth certificates are regularized in America. The issue of patchily recorded birth data would finally come to a head in World War II. At this time, get the baby boom going, ammunition factories and other defense projects were creating thousands of new jobs for citizens. However, to take advantage of this, you had to be able to prove that you were a citizen in the U.S. This presented a problem around 43 million Americans who had no way of proving their citizen status. Despite being born in the USA, while news media encouraged holdouts to get registered, the demands of World War II slowed the process. Finally, in 1914, as a part of a drive to improve the national health policies and welfare, the State Office of Vital Statistics became responsible for birth certificates. This would have oversight on how birth data should be recorded, while the states would be responsible for record keeping as before. How birth certificates are issued today. When a baby is born anywhere in the country today, a certificate of live birth application form is completed. If the birth takes place in a hospital, administrative staff will help you handle this. However, if you have a home birth, you may need to take additional steps to ensure your newborn is properly registered. Once a certificate of live birth and birth certificate application forms are filled out, you will need to send the files to your state or county's Office of Vital Records to get your baby's birth certificate. This can usually be done by mail or in person. In some states, you will also receive a birth certificate registration card after applying. You will then need to wait a number of weeks for the Vital Records Office to process a request. The time this takes depends on what state you are in. Noted Kentucky's information was not up there. The history of birth certificates may be relatively short in the scheme of things, however, it demonstrates the pace of growth and development record keeping in the country over the last century. Everyone born in the United States needs a birth certificate. It is essential for many purposes important, such as getting vital IDs and passports. It also proves that you have the right to U.S. citizenship. If yours gets lost, it is essential to apply for a replacement copy as soon as possible to ensure you can prove always your identity to other vital information. Read more.